The year was 1878, and the world for Elias Blackwood had shrunk to the size of his smithy. It was a world of soot and sweat, of fire and iron, a place where the only reliable conversation was the rhythmic clang of his hammer against the anvil. His forge stood at the frayed edge of Providence, a town that clung to the vast, unforgiving prairie like a nervous hand gripping a knife. Beyond the town, the land rolled on into territory that belonged to the Cheyenne, the Lakota, and the 5 other tribes of the Confederation, fact that kept the residents of Providence in a perpetual state of low-grade fear. Elias preferred the fear of the known wilderness to the suffocating judgment within the town's dusty streets. Grief had been the architect of his isolation. It had built the walls around his heart higher and thicker than any fortress. Years ago, before the war had carved a limp into his leg and a permanent winter into his soul, there had been Clara, there had been a son, little Samuel. A fever, swift and merciless, had taken them both, leaving behind a silence so profound that Elias had fled into the noise of the army, hoping to hammer the memories out of his head. The war had only added new ghosts to the ones he already carried. Now, his life was a metronome of routine. Rise at dawn, light the forge, heat the iron, shape it, quench it, and start again. It was a penance and a refuge, a way to pass the days without having to truly live them. The people of Providence saw him as a surly recluse, a man with embers in his eyes and a past he never spoke of. They brought him their broken plowshares and dull axe heads, paid their coin, and left him to his solitude. They didn't see the way his hand would sometimes pause over the forge, his mind lost in the image of a small hand clutching his finger. They didn't understand that the ferocious heat he commanded was the only warmth he had left. His strength was a shell, his skill a distraction. He was a man hollowed out, living a life of quiet resignation, waiting for an end he was too stubborn to seek himself. The storm arrived as dusk was bleeding into night, a bruise of purple and grey spreading across the sky. The wind howled like a thing grieving, rattling the loose boards of the smithy and driving stinging rain against the wide-open doors. Elias was banking the forge, the glow painting his worn face in shades of orange and black, when a figure materialized in the doorway, framed by the tempest. He was not a man from the town. He was Cheyenne. The warrior stood tall despite the exhaustion that radiated from him. Rain plastered his black hair to his high cheekbones and darkened his buckskin clothing. He leaned heavily on the shattered shaft of a spear, a weapon that even in its broken state possessed a fearsome beauty. A dark, wet stain was spreading across his left side, a testament to a recent and violent encounter. Elias's hand instinctively went to the heavy forging hammer that rested on the anvil. The ingrained caution of the frontier, the years of soldiering, the town's simmering hostility, it all screamed at him to drive the man away. But the warrior did not move, he did not speak. His eyes, dark and deep, met Elias's. There was no plea in them, no threat. There was only a profound weariness and a look of loss so sharp and familiar that it struck a chord deep within Elias's own hollowed-out chest. The man's gaze kept shifting from Elias's face to the broken spear in his hand. The weapon's head, a formidable piece of sharpened steel, was snapped cleanly from the fire-hardened ashwood. The shaft itself was covered in intricate carvings and beadwork, a history etched into its grain. Elias saw it then. The man wasn't just mourning a broken weapon, he was mourning a part of himself. It was the same desolate look Elias saw in his own reflection on the surface of the quenching trough on quiet mornings. The blacksmith's calloused fingers loosened their grip on the hammer. He was so tired of fighting, tired of the walls, tired of the ghosts. With a heavy sigh that seemed to pull up years of dust from his lungs, he gave a short, sharp nod toward the dry space near the forge. It was not an invitation of warmth, but a reluctant concession, an acknowledgement of a shared language of broken things. The warrior, Vohkinne, stepped inside, his moccasins silent on the hard-packed dirt floor. He moved with a grace that even injury could not entirely steal. The smithy, which had always felt like a tomb, now held a second living, breathing soul, and the air crackled with a tension thicker than the storm outside. Elias gestured towards a low stool. Vohkinne lowered himself onto it carefully, his breath hissing through his teeth as the movement pulled at the gash in his side. He never took his eyes off Elias. Communication was a bridge built of gestures and intent. Elias pointed to the wound. Vohkinne nodded, his face a mask of stoicism. Elias went to a small wooden chest where he kept his meager supplies. He brought back a bottle of carbolic acid, clean rags, and a needle threaded with gut. He did not ask for permission. He simply knelt and began to clean the wound, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were instruments of force. Vohkinne sat perfectly still, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers of the forge. He did not flinch when the acid stung, or when the needle pierced his skin, stitching the torn flesh back together. Elias worked with a focused, detached efficiency, the same he applied to mending a crack in a bell. It was a problem to be solved, a piece of broken material to be made whole again. When the wound was dressed, a heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the drumming of the rain and the whisper of the wind. Vohkinne finally held out the broken spear. He offered it not as a customer, but as a supplicant, laying a sacred relic upon an altar. Elias took the two pieces, his hands feeling the weight and balance of what it once was. The spearhead was masterfully forged, but not by a white man. The steel had a different temper, a pattern in the metal he hadn't seen before. The ash shaft was smooth with use, its surface a canvas of stories. Elias could make out the shapes of buffalo, of eagles, of a running wolf, and what looked like the figures of a woman and a child. A life story. Elias ran a thumb over the carving of the child, and for a fleeting, painful moment, he saw Samuel's face. He looked up and met Vohkinne's eyes. The warrior's gaze flickered to Elias's leg, the one that always favored his weight, and then back to his face. There was no pity in the look, only a quiet, stark understanding. In that moment, they were not white man and Indian, not former soldier and warrior. They were just two men, marked by the world, each carrying the weight of their own history. Elias turned to the forge without a word. He thrust the bellows handle down, and the embers awoke with a hungry roar, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He would not just fix this spear. He would reforge it. The task took on a life of its own, becoming more than a simple repair. It became an act of respect, a conversation between two craftsmen across a cultural divide. Elias examined the snapped tang, the point where the metal had been seated in the wood. A simple weld would be weak, a crude patch on a fine instrument. It demanded more. He worked through the night, the storm his orchestra, the fire his sun. He carefully heated the spearhead, not to a brilliant white heat that would ruin its temper, but to a glowing cherry red. He drew out the broken tang, hammering it, folding it, shaping it into a new, longer, stronger socket that would cradle the wood. The rhythm of his work was a prayer he had forgotten he knew. Heat, hammer, shape. Heat, hammer, shape. It was the only language he was fluent in, the only truth he had left. And Vohkinne watched. He did not sleep. He sat on the stool, a silent sentinel, his presence a strange comfort. He watched the fire breathe. He watched the muscles in Elias's arms and back move with practiced power. He watched the sparks fly like fleeting stars in the dark smithy. In his focused gaze, Elias felt something he had not felt in years. Seen. His craft, the one thing he had poured all his brokenness into, was being witnessed not as a mere service, but as a ceremony. As the hours wore on, the tension in the room began to soften, like iron in the heat. Sometime after midnight, Vohkinne reached into a small pouch at his belt and pulled out a strip of dried meat and a piece of hard, crumbly bread. He held them out to Elias. It was a simple offering, but it felt as significant as a treaty. Elias paused, his face slick with sweat, and wiped his hands on his leather apron. He took the food and ate, the salt of the meat sharp and real on his tongue. They shared the meager meal in silence, the unspoken acknowledgement of shared labor and mutual respect hanging between them. Elias finished the metalwork as the first hint of dawn began to gray the edges of the night. The new socket was a thing of dark, brutal beauty, seamless and strong. He then turned his attention to the wood, carefully fitting the shaft, securing it with a wrapping of wet rawhide that would shrink as it dried, binding wood and steel together as if they had never been parted. It was stronger now than it had been before. He held it for a moment, feeling its renewed power, its unbroken spirit. Then he turned and presented it to Vohkinne. The warrior took it, his hands tracing the lines of the new work. He tested its weight, its balance. He ran a finger over the smooth, dark metal of the socket where it met the carved wood. He looked from the spear to Elias, and his face, which had been a mask of stoic control all night, softened with an expression of profound, unshielded gratitude. Vohkinne reached for another pouch at his hip, this one ornately decorated with blue and white beads. He held it out, an offer of payment. Elias looked at the pouch, then at the mended spear, then at the man holding it. Something inside him, a long frozen river, began to thaw. This night had not been a transaction. It had been something else, something quieter and more significant. To accept payment would be to diminish it, to turn it back into a simple job. He shook his head, a small, firm gesture. "No," he said, the word rough from disuse. He tapped his own chest. "No charge." Vohkinne paused, his eyes searching Elias's face, seeking to understand the nature of this refusal. He saw no pity, no condescension. He saw only a strange and quiet honor. After a long moment, the warrior nodded slowly. He rose from the stool, his movements still stiff from his injury, but his stature restored by the whole spear in his hand. With a final, lingering look at Elias, a look that conveyed more than words ever could, he turned and slipped out of the smithy, disappearing into the pale, rain-washed light of the new day. Elias stood alone, the silence of the forge returning, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty. It was filled with the echo of a shared vigil. He felt an exhaustion deeper than any he had known from labor, but it was clean, honest fatigue. He had mended a broken thing, and in doing so, he felt a hairline crack in his own soul begin to seal. He had no idea that the ripples from his small act of free labor were already spreading, and that they would return to his shore as a tidal wave. The morning passed in a haze of weariness. Elias cleaned his tools and swept the smithy, the familiar motions a comfort. It was just past noon when the sound began, a low rumble from the town that grew into a nervous buzz. He stepped to the doorway and looked toward Providence. People were gathering in the street, pointing, their faces tight with anxiety. He followed their gaze to the east, and his blood ran cold. A column of riders was approaching. They were not soldiers, they were warriors, 7 of them, riding with a slow, deliberate purpose that was more intimidating than any charge. Each man was dressed in the formal regalia of his station, their feather bonnets and decorated war shirts a brilliant, terrifying splash of color against the drab prairie. Even from this distance, Elias could feel the weight of their authority. Before he could fully process the sight, a group of men burst from the town and hurried towards his forge. At their lead was Sheriff Callahan, a man whose authority was derived more from his loud voice and his badge than from any innate courage. His face was pale and blotchy with fear and anger. "Blackwood," Callahan shouted, his voice tight. "We saw him. The whole town saw that Cheyenne leave your forge at dawn." The men behind him muttered in agreement, their eyes darting from Elias to the approaching chiefs, then back again, filled with accusation. "What did you do, Blackwood?" the sheriff demanded, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "What devil's bargain did you make with them? Are you a traitor?" Elias looked at their frightened, angry faces. He saw the same prejudice and fear that had festered in this town since its founding. He felt the old walls inside him begin to rise again, the familiar impulse to retreat into surly silence. but the memory of the night, of the shared respect in the firelight, held him back. "I fixed a broken spear," Elias said, his voice level. "Fixed his spear?" One of the townsmen scoffed. "You armed him, and now look, they're coming for us." Panic was starting to curdle into a mob mentality, but their fear was eclipsed by a greater one. The 7 chiefs did not ride to the center of Providence. They rode directly to the smithy, their ponies stopping in a line before the open doors, creating a formidable barrier between Elias and the townsmen. The air grew thick and still. Sheriff Callahan and his posse were frozen, trapped between their suspect and the very source of their terror. The chiefs dismounted with a fluid, unified grace. They were men of power, their faces weathered maps of wisdom and war. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth. Elias stood his ground in the doorway of his forge, his heart hammering against his ribs, not with fear, but with a strange, uncertain anticipation. One of the chiefs, an older man with a face of noble gravity and streaks of silver in his long black hair, stepped forward. He wore the insignia of a Lakota leader. He surveyed the scene, the terrified townsman, the bristling sheriff, and finally, Elias, standing alone in the shadows of his forge. The chief's eyes met Elias's. "You are the one they call Blackwood?" he asked. His English was clear, measured, and carried an undeniable authority. Elias swallowed, his throat dry. "I am." Sheriff Callahan, finding a sliver of courage, stepped forward. "I am the law in this town, Chief Tashunka. If you have business here, you speak to me." Tashunka did not even glance at him. His focus remained entirely on Elias. "We have not come for the man who wears a tin star," the chief said, his voice resonating with quiet power. "We have come to speak with the man who works with iron and honor." The gathered townsfolk murmured in confusion. This was not the attack they had expected. "The warrior who came to you last night," Tashunka continued, "his name is Vohkinne. He is a great leader of the Cheyenne, and he is husband to my daughter. He came to you in need." Elias simply nodded, waiting. "The spear you mended was not just a weapon," Tashunka explained, his voice taking on a new resonance, a tone of history and reverence. "It is the wotai, the spirit spear of his clan. It has been passed from father to son for more generations than this town has stood for years. It is a part of our story, a piece of our soul." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Vohkinne broke the spear, saving our winter camp from a great bear that had gone mad with hunger. He saved the lives of women and children, but in his victory, the spear was broken. It was an act of great courage, but it brought him great shame. A man cannot lead his people with a broken spirit." Tashunka took a step closer, his gaze sweeping over Elias, taking in the worn leather apron, the soot-stained hands, the weary lines on his face. "He told us what happened here. He said you tended his wound without question. He said you looked upon the spirit spear not as a savage's tool, but with the eyes of a true craftsman. He watched you work through the night, giving the spear a strength it did not have before. You did not just patch it, you made it whole again." The chief's gaze was intense, searching, and when it was done, he said, his voice dropping slightly, "You refused his payment. You asked for nothing in return for your skill, your fire, your time." Elias felt the eyes of every manchief and townsman alike upon him. He felt exposed, his simple, private act laid bare for all to see. He could only stand his ground and meet the chief's gaze. "An act of honor for its own sake is a rare thing in this world," Tashunka declared, his voice rising so that all could hear. "My treaty partners in the fort would demand 100 horses for such a service and still call it a favor. You, a man we thought was our enemy, showed a deeper understanding of respect than those who swear oaths of friendship. You did not see a Cheyenne. You saw a man with a broken treasure, and you mended it." He turned his head slightly, finally acknowledging the stunned sheriff and the silent crowd. "We did not ride here for war. War is for broken men. We rode here to see the man who understands that a kindness given without condition builds a stronger bridge than any treaty." Tashunka gestured to one of the other chiefs, who stepped forward carrying a large, carefully folded bundle wrapped in tanned hide. He presented it to the Lakota leader. "You have shown our people a great honor, Elias Blackwood," Tashunka said, his voice now gentle, "and honor must be met with honor. We bring you this gift, a symbol of peace from the 7 tribes, a sign that we recognize you as a man of true spirit." With a powerful and fluid motion, he and the other chief unfurled the bundle. It was a magnificent white buffalo robe, a sacred object of immense spiritual significance and rarity. The hide was creamy white, soft as winter snow, and its presence seemed to sanctify the dusty ground before the smithy. It was a gift beyond price, a gesture of profound respect that silenced every whisper, every doubt. Elias stared at the robe, then at the 7 solemn faces of the chiefs. He looked past them, at the shocked and bewildered faces of the people of Providence. Their world of simple hatreds and clear-cut enemies had just been irrevocably complicated. They had seen a traitor consorting with the enemy. The chiefs had seen a man of peace building a bridge. In that moment, the forge, Elias's refuge from the world, had become the very center of it. He slowly, reverently, reached out and took the robe. Its weight was real, substantial in his hands. It was the heaviest and the lightest thing he had ever held. He looked at Tashunka and managed a single profound word. "Thank you." The chiefs departed as they had arrived, with a quiet and immense dignity. They mounted their ponies and rode back toward the open plains, leaving behind a stunned town and a lone blacksmith standing in his doorway, holding a symbol of peace. The silence that descended in their wake was different from the one that had come before. It was not the silence of fear, but of awe. Elias was left with the robe, a tangible testament to the night's strange magic. He carefully folded the sacred hide and brought it inside, laying it over the old wooden chest that held the few mementos he had of Clara and Samuel. The white of the robe seemed to glow in the dim light of the smithy, a beacon of peace in a room that had for so long been a shrine to his pain. The air no longer felt stale with loneliness. It felt clean, as if the storm had washed away more than just the dust. In the days that followed, the town of Providence changed, or rather, its perception of Elias Blackwood changed. The fear and suspicion were replaced by a grudging, then genuine, respect. He was no longer the surly, broken recluse. He was the man the chiefs came to see. People spoke to him differently. They met his eyes in the street. Their requests for work were couched in a new deference. Sheriff Callahan avoided him entirely, unable to reconcile the blacksmith he thought he knew with the man honored by the 7 tribes. Elias did not change his ways. He remained a man of few words, dedicated to his forge, but the isolation had been breached. The walls around his heart, while still there, now had a gate. Sometimes he would find a gift left silently at his door, a brace of rabbits, a bundle of sage, a finely woven basket of wild berries. There were never any words, just the quiet, ongoing acknowledgement from a people who understood that respect was a currency far more valuable than coin. Weeks later, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the prairie, Elias stood at his anvil. He heated a piece of iron, the familiar glow, a comforting presence. The rhythmic clang of his hammer was no longer a sound of lonely penance. It was the sound of a man at work, a man with a place in the world. His gaze fell upon the white buffalo robe, draped in a place of honor. He had learned that a single act of kindness, offered without expectation, could ripple outwards in ways one could never predict. It could mend more than just a broken spear. It could mend the fractures between peoples, challenge the certainties of hatred, and even begin to heal the deepest cracks in a broken human heart. He was still Elias Blackwood, blacksmith. But he was no longer a man defined solely by his ghosts. The fire in his forge no longer just burned away the past. It now forged a future, one piece of glowing, hopeful iron at a time.